Today from the Global Lane, Israel under pressure in Gaza and the Golan. How will the Jewish state respond? My interview with Israel's representative at the UN. Also in the Middle East, ISIS brought death, destruction, and genocide. Is the Islamic terror group dead or making a comeback? On the home front, David Brody's exclusive on why religious freedom is important to America's Secretary of State. And made in the USA. Yes, America is back. The positive news you may have missed.
And it's all right here, right now, from the Global Lane. As the American media obsesses over Helsinki and President Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin, there's some news that has received scant attention. Israelis spent hours hunkered down in the safety of bomb shelters after Palestinians launched a barrage of rockets against them from Gaza. It was the biggest attack since the Gaza War of 2014. Now, here to discuss this and more is Israel's representative to the United Nations. He's Ambassador Danny Danon. Mr. Ambassador, welcome. It's glad to have you here at CBN this time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so tell me about this. The media didn't pay a lot of attention to it. What we did see in the media was criticism of Israel. How do you handle this situation? What do you do to minimize the threat?
Pick any country in the world and imagine that in one weekend you would have 200 rockets flown into that city. It will be everywhere in the news. That's what happened last weekend in Israel. More than 200 mortars and missiles came from Gaza into our cities, tried to hit innocent Israelis, and it was anywhere. It is unfortunate. It shows the double standard that Israel is being treated, not only at the UN, but also by the international media. But we are strong. We will prevail, and we are very optimistic because we have a strong army that defends our people.
Well, I was going to ask you, so what do you do about it? How do you minimize this threat against Israel coming from Gaza?
Our policy is very clear. If the children in southern Israel are not able to sleep at night, the Hamas terrorists will not be able to sleep at night. We used our mighty army, we used our Air Force, and we targeted military facilities of Hamas, a terrorist organization. But I ask more. When I will go to the UN, I will demand that they will designate Hamas as a terrorist organization. The same way you designated Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Hamas should be on the list of the terror organizations.
I think Hezbollah is also on that list for the U.S., is it not?
For the U.S., not for the UN.
Yeah.
In the UN, they cannot even name Hezbollah or Hamas. They cannot say, let's condemn those organizations. They are afraid from facing those evil forces.
Your Knesset just recently passed legislation declaring that Israel is actually a Jewish state. What's wrong with that?
That's a fact. It's obvious. Like in the U.S., you have a constitution. In Israel, we do not have a constitution. We have basic laws. And this law actually speaks about the character of Israel. It speaks about our national anthem, about our flag, about our language. Israel is a full democracy. Muslim, Christian, and Jews have the same equal rights. So there is no problem with this legislation, but some people cannot recognize Israel as a Jewish state. That's why they are against any kind of legislation.
Well, so what do you do about that? Do you just...
We continue to strive. We continue to educate our children. We continue to build our economy. And at the same time, we have a strong army to defend ourselves. We cannot live according to the expectations of our adversaries at the UN. We see a lot of hypocrisy coming mainly from European countries who tend to blame Israel for everything. And I think when they look at the reality today, they understand Israel is not the problem. Israel is a solution for the problems in the Middle East.
President Trump at his Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin said that relations between Israel and Russia have improved, that there's a good relationship between Bibi Netanyahu, your prime minister, and also Vladimir Putin. So what has the difference been? How has that changed Israel and the Middle East, having a better relationship with Russia?
For us, it's important to have a strong relationship with everybody. The U.S. is the strongest ally. It will always will be our strongest ally. I feel it every day at the UN, working with Ambassador Haley. But it's important for us to speak also with the Russians, mainly about Syria, because we know that the Iranians, they want to stay in Syria. They want to take over Syria. We think it will be a threat not only for Israel, but also for other countries in the region, and we should not allow the Iranians to take over Syria. Look what happened in Lebanon. Today, the Iranians control Lebanon. They have the Hezbollah forces next to our border. We don't want to have a similar reality in the border with Syria. This is the message that Prime Minister Netanyahu delivered to Mr. Putin.
So a lot of suffering in 6.5 years in Syria. How do we bring about the end of that war? Is Russia the key? What's the key to end it?
First, I agree with you. We look at the pictures, we see the devastation. We are trying to help people in Syria. And I took a delegation of ambassadors with me to Israel, and we met with Syrian refugees. And they were shocked to hear the refugees speaking about Jews in Israel supporting Muslims in Syria. So we do whatever we can, and we hope that there will be some kind of stability in Syria. But at the same time, we don't want the Iranian to be next to our border.
Yes, we saw in Dara the Israelis helping people who had long considered Israel their enemy, reaching out and helping them, humanitarian aid workers from Israel.
We have a special project, it's called Good Neighbor, where we provide humanitarian support, tents, medical equipment, food, and we deliver it directly to the people who need it next to our border. And yes, they are surprised, but you know, we are all human beings. We cannot sit idly by when we see those pictures.
The U.S. has enacted legislation, I think back in December, called the Taylor Force Act. And what that did is it ended the pay-to-slay U.S. taxpayer support of Palestinians. In turn, there were the Palestinian Authority giving money to terrorists and the families of terrorists. We ended that. What's the effort like getting other countries to follow suit?
This is very important. We need to understand it. When you have the Palestinian Authority, which is a kind of a government, takes funds from the government and pay terrorists to kill innocent Israelis a monthly salary. It can be up to $3,000 a month for life. And they're taking international aid support and use that money to pay the families of terrorists. I think it was a very important legislation. In Israel, we have a similar legislation, and we saw Australia joining the US, and hopefully other countries will do the same. We encourage people to support humanitarian projects, but you should not support the culture of hate of the Palestinians.
Now, so far, is it just the U.S. and Australia, or other countries, Western countries, coming along?
So now it's the U.S. and Australia, but we hear about some other European countries considering to divert their support to other places.
Well, are you optimistic about that, or?
I am, but we have to listen to the Palestinians. They say it very clearly. Despite all the legislations, we will continue to pay salaries to terrorists. Nevertheless, what will be the outcome? So they will take funds from other projects, schools, infrastructure, and they will divert them into paying salaries for terrorists. This is a bad message for the next generation of Palestinians growing up today in Judea and Samaria.
You know, when I met you in New York earlier this year, you seemed very like you're an optimist. You seem very optimistic about the future and the prospects for peace in the Middle East and between Israel and the Palestinians. Now, with all this Gaza situation going on, you know, we saw the rushing of the border and crossing and infiltrating into Israel at the time of the Jerusalem embassy dedication, the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem. Also, we saw the kites, the arson fires that began into Israel as a result of Palestinians sending those kites in. Now, most recently, the rockets. So are you still optimistic? How do you feel about the prospects for peace?
First, you have to be optimistic. You have to be a believer to survive in the United Nations. Yeah. And I'm optimistic because look what we achieved in short 70 years. We had wars, we had terror attacks. But despite all of those attacks and hatred, we built a miracle, a beautiful, thriving democracy in our region. So I think we will continue to do that. But at the same time, we have to make sure we have a strong army. We have to be grateful for our friends in the US standing with Israel, supporting Israel. We need that support because Hamas is not going anywhere. Hezbollah, they will stay there. And Iran is still there. So we will have challenges in the future, but at the same time, we have the capability to face those challenges.
Now, before you leave, I know you're on a tight schedule. I've got to ask you about Ireland, because the Irish are considering a bill right now that would ban all products from the so-called settlements in the West Bank, and then punish anyone, any company or any individual who does business with Israel with those products. What are the ramifications of that legislation, not only for Israel, but for the United States and our companies?
I hope it will not pass. It's not going to help anyone. You know, some countries in Europe believe that they can force a peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So they will force us to give land or to divide Jerusalem. It doesn't work that way. In order to achieve peace, you need to then negotiate directly. We proved it when we negotiated with Egypt and Jordan. So they cannot impose anything. Second, they will hurt the Palestinians, because many Palestinians work in the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, in industrial areas. So now, when they will actually start to boycott, they will boycott Palestinian workers. And third, they will hurt the people of Ireland, because the US passed legislation that you are not allowed to boycott any country. The government can decide whom to boycott. So those companies will have to decide whether they are boycotting the US or they're boycotting Israel. I think they would choose not to boycott Israel.
Okay, we're out of time, and I know you have to go. The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, a representative for Israel, Danny Danon, thank you so much for being with us. Good to see you again. God bless you.
God bless you.
Iraqis recently celebrated the one-year anniversary of the liberation of Mosul. Tens of thousands of displaced Christians have returned to their cities and villages in the Nineveh Plain, but many refuse to return to Mosul. 30,000 Christians lived in Iraq's second largest city before the Islamic State moved in, and today only about 100 or so have returned. Investigative journalist author Ken Timmerman understands all too well what many Iraqi Christians are up against. He's written a new book. It's called ISIS Begins. It's a novel about the Iraq War. It includes stories about suffering Christians. Ken, thanks so much for joining us. So why a novel this time? We're so used to your investigative reporting of events.
Well, thank you, Gary. Thanks for having me on. Look, the tragedy that these Christians are undergoing is remarkable. We only get it through the filter of the media. We don't really see and feel and understand. You have to go on the ground to understand what these people have gone through. I've done that many, many times, both on mission trips and reporting trips. And so I thought it was important to give you that ground truth, to give readers a ground truth so they could get a better understanding of what it means to be a persecuted Christian, to be chased by jihadi Muslim groups.
Yeah, it's one of the worst tragedies in the world today. So please share one of the most compelling stories from your book, Ken. I'm sure it's based on fact.
Well, the central character is an Iraqi Christian interpreter. He's working for U.S. Special Forces in Iraq, and he's chased by a jihadi cell leader, comes back. He tries to take his family to Jordan to get U.S. asylum, as the U.S. government had promised. But of course, they prefer to bring Muslims into the United States and not Christians. This is a sad fact of the State Department bureaucracy. So he goes back to Iraq and winds up on a mission trip with a group of U.S. pastors and others. And they are attacked while they're handing out aid in the Nineveh Plain by a jihadi terrorist dressed as a woman. And the central character's brother, who's a guard there, gets killed in that attack trying to defend the people in a tent receiving aid because they're destitute.
And Ken, this really isn't fiction. I mean, these are things that have happened in the past and are continuing to happen there.
They're happening all the time. I've interviewed so many people on the ground in Mosul, in the Nineveh Plain, in Al-Qush, where the events at the end of my novel take place. There's a jihadi attack on this monastery up in the hills there. It's really quite extraordinary. And at the time, I have U.S. Special Forces kind of coming to the rescue. The air cavalry comes in, and there's a big battle at the end. But it would have been great if it had happened that way on the ground. It did not. The Christians were never rescued. They had to flee, and they fled for their lives. And many of them, as we know, they just didn't make it.
And Ken, I was in Al-Qush as many Christians came into that city. It's a Christian city. They look for protection. We handed out relief there. So I know what you're talking about. What can you tell us about the current situation, though, on the ground for Iraqi Christians? I think many Americans mistakenly think that everything's fine now that ISIS has been defeated, but that isn't the case. Tell us what you've learned.
No, it's not the case, and people are afraid, and it's understandable that they're afraid, but they're afraid because the networks are still there underground. Especially, you mentioned Mosul in your intro, and you're absolutely right. In the Nineveh Plain, they have slightly different problems. They don't have security. They've been trying to have an Assyrian Christian police force there for many, many years, and the Kurds have been blocking it, unfortunately. That's what they need. They need security on the ground. But in Mosul, they really need to root out these jihadi groups that are underground that are still there. That's a real underlying problem. People are just afraid. They're afraid they will again be targeted.
Well, I know because, I've talked to people as well in Iraq who've told me, why should I go back to the same town that I lived in where my neighbors turned against me? It'll just happen again. And I know that you warned everyone about the consequences of the American pullout from Iraq and the rise of groups like ISIS. And how likely is it that another ISIS-like terrorist group will rise up and cause more bloodshed?
Well, if we leave Iraq, they will, and because that's where ISIS began, hence my title, ISIS Begins. When President Obama announced the date certain of the U.S. withdrawal, the jihadi groups that had been defeated, utterly defeated during the surge under President Bush, they just decided to bide their time. They knew when they could come back out onto the main streets, if you wish, and they combined together with the stay-behind networks of Saddam Hussein. Those networks are still there, and the combination of al-Qaeda, if you wish, and those stay-behind Ba'athist networks, that's what gave us ISIS, and that symbiosis, those two groups are still there on the ground.
Well, Ken, how then can our viewers make a difference in the lives of Iraqi Christians of this time? What would you suggest we do?
Well, there are a number of aid groups who are distributing aid. You've certainly been involved with some of them. Frank Gaffney at the Center for Security Policy has put together a coalition called SaveThePersecutedChristians.org. I've also worked with Christian Solidarity International, a tremendous group. And their partner on the ground is called the Hammurabi Human Rights Organization, HHRO.org. They are run by absolutely amazing people, Iraqi Christians themselves. They're on the ground in the Nineveh Plain. They do wonderful work. But any of those groups are really worthy of our viewers' support.
Okay, the novel is ISIS Begins. Ken Timmerman, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
For 3 years, ISIS ruled large parts of Iraq and Syria. Now a French Catholic priest is working to hold them accountable for their crimes. Eric Rosales brings us the fascinating story of Patrick Desbois.
This ISIS propaganda video shows Yazidi men being paraded around an Iraqi village, caged in the back of a truck. Terrorists then line them up in front of a pit and shoot the men one by one.
ISIS, they know their enemies, but we know much less about them. They know us, we don't know them. So it's why we have to wake up, we have to be open eyes, we have to believe in God, but to see the reality in front. Otherwise, we can be any day a victim.
Father Patrick Dubois is documenting crimes ISIS has committed against the Yazidi people, an ancient religious minority in Iraq. His group, Yahdin Unun, which translates to Together in One, has interviewed nearly 300 Yazidis, recounting stories of rapes, executions, and other vicious crimes.
Yeah, it's happening right now. Everybody says ISIS is dead, but with my team, when we go in Iraq, we still meet Yazidi who just escaped from them. Recently, we met a girl. She has been sold 25 times to 25 persons.
Father Dubois says ISIS is an effective killing machine, operating almost scientifically, much like Hitler did, methodically killing Jews during the Holocaust. He writes about his findings in his new book, The Terrorist Factory, ISIS, the Yazidi Genocide, and Exporting Terror.
What happened with the Germans when we arrived?
For 15 years, Father Dubois studied the mass murder of 1.5 million Jews by Hitler's mobile death squads. He and his team interviewed nearly 6,000 witnesses, reconstructed thousands of massacres, and identified nearly 2,500 previously unknown execution sites. That work has resulted in 2 books documenting what Father Dubois has dubbed the the Holocaust by bullets. He says the Nazis and ISIS share tactics such as public executions and enlisting local help in their murders.
They arrive in the morning in a village, let's say in Russia or in Ukraine. They say to the Jews, don't worry, we go to Palestine, we deport you to Palestine. They arrive in a Yazidi village, say, don't worry, convert to Islam, put a white flag, nobody would happen.
Father Dubois says in both instances, the victims often end up that same night in mass graves, many times buried alive. It's the same system, the same methodology, and the same evil. But what makes ISIS more dangerous is boys from ages 7 to 11 are sent to camps to be turned into terrorists. He says their days are filled with Islamic prayers, terrorist training, and learning the Quran. Each night they're exposed to videos of beheadings and crucifixions.
They say to the children, we will all die. We'll die in Mosul, we'll die in Raqqa, but you, the small children, you will survive, and you have a mission. One boy, he told me they stole my brain. I never heard anybody saying that they stole my brain.
Father Dubois' organization is now helping the kids find their souls with the Jihad Center in Kurdistan, Iraq. Volunteers teach the kids about Jesus, his love, and forgiveness, while the women learn skills such as sewing to support themselves. Father Dubois says it's important to not just prove that murderous acts took place, but to prove such killings are not an unstoppable global force, and with God, change is possible. Eric Rosales, CBN News.
In Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo hosted the first ever worldwide conference on religious freedom. In a recent interview with David Brody, Pompeo said his Christian faith explains why this issue is so important to him.
Unfortunately, religious persecution is nothing new, and in recent years it's grown. In an attempt to stop that trend, more than 80 high-level government ministers will come together to promote religious freedom. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tells CBN News it's a major priority for this administration.
The advancement of religious freedom matters to every individual in every country. The human dignity, the human right attached to religious freedom, I feel personally, I know President Trump does as well.
The overall concept is to show evidence that greater religious freedom means less terrorism and a better economy. Experts say roughly 3/4 of the world's population face some restriction on religious freedom. As for Christians, 1 out of every 12 experience extreme persecution in the most dangerous countries on the State Department's worldwide watch list.
Not every country will achieve the level of religious freedom that we have here in the United States, but we think we can advance it all across the world by bringing together folks from all faiths, and frankly those who have no faith. But their capacity to practice religion in the way that they choose is important for the world.
For Pompeo, this is also personal because his evangelical Christian faith compels him to take action.
Your faith, I know, is very, very important to you. You've talked about this in public before. So why this seems, there's the public policy aspect, but it's also personal.
Look, it's very consistent with what the Trump administration is trying to achieve with respect to religious freedom. But it also fits with my worldview. I'm an evangelical Christian. I know that not everyone shares that faith, but it's important. It's important not only that Christians, but people of all faiths have the capacity to worship in the way that they desire.
One of the biggest offenders is North Korea, and Pompeo already has his hands full there, negotiating with Kim Jong-un to get rid of his nuclear weapons.
We need to see Chairman Kim do what he promised the world he would do.
North Korea's human rights record is just as suspect as their inaction on nuclear weapons. The country ranks #1 as the most dangerous country for Christians. While Secretary Pompeo wouldn't reveal his conversations with Kim, he did make one thing very clear in our interview.
I want your viewers to know that the United States rarely has an encounter with a country where we don't raise human rights concerns where they exist. We know the history there in North Korea.
And the U.S. hopes to write a new chapter with this historic conference to stop religious persecution and make a difference around the world. David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
I want to share some good news with you that you may have missed because of the media's obsession with Russia. America is back. The president calls it an economic revival. In church revivals, the Holy Spirit brings miracles and healings. In this economic revival, Donald Trump's policies are bringing jobs and opportunity back to America.
For decades, the United States allowed other countries to steal our jobs, close our factories, and plunder our wealth. What was happening was horrible. I used to talk about it for 20 years in the private sector. I said, how did they let this happen? Little did I know I'd get my shot. That's what happened.
And with Donald Trump's shot, manufacturing is leading the way to a revived economy. 3.7 million jobs have been created since Trump was elected president in November 2016. 370,000 of those are manufacturing jobs. Overall, 1 million workers have returned to the American job force. Unemployment claims are at their lowest level in half a century. Manufacturing wages are expected to rise at the fastest rate in more than 17 years. 95% of American manufacturers say they're optimistic about the future. The president says that's the highest level ever recorded. America's reclaiming its proud manufacturing heritage.
Our leaders in Washington did nothing. They did nothing. They let our factories leave. They let our people lose their jobs, given to other jobs, workers in faraway lands. That's not free trade. That's fool's trade. That's stupid trade. And we don't do that kind of trade anymore.
The mainstream media and others will try to frighten you into believing that a big trade war will soon transpire because of the president's tariffs. But so far, tariffs on steel are helping the USA. Example, U.S. Steel says it will open 6 more plants and expand others. The president traveled to Granite City, Illinois, where a U.S. Steel plant just reopened. That means 500 jobs restored for workers there.
Today, we declare a simple truth. It matters where something is made. It matters to me. You know, I'd hear the globalists talking about, like, it's okay to close a car factory or a car plant in Michigan, and it's okay to move that plant to Mexico and hire different workers and fire everybody in Michigan, but it's not okay for me. To me, it's a very bad thing, and that's stopping. Plants are moving back to Michigan, and they're moving back in big numbers.
Moving back to Ohio, Iowa, and Pennsylvania, said the president. Confidence in Trump's economy is much higher than it was during the final year of Obama's presidency. And a recent Rasmussen poll found a new high in optimism about economic opportunity in the country. 68% of American adults now say anyone who really wants to work can find a job. President Trump made it clear he'll keep fighting for America and its workers.
America never waves the white flag. We only wave the red, white, and blue flag. The era of economic surrender for the United States is over.
Yes, an economic revival is underway. And with another election fast approaching, maybe that's why the only thing we keep hearing from liberal politicians and the mainstream media is still Russia, Russia, Russia. Yes, America, there is good news. We're in a new era of economic prosperity. No longer is Made in the USA a slogan from days gone by. There's a lot of potential in this country, and the best is yet to come. Economically, America is truly great again. Let's all pray it continues. Well, that's it from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.